it. I said something about that the other day, taking the grandkids to school. I said, you know what? It's almost Christmas. Hadley said, no, it's not. I got to go to school. Said, well, okay. So, but we are looking at the Christmas story from different ways that maybe you're accustomed to. And that's intentional because we're trying to make a point. And I'm trying to hook this on my belt. If it'll go, I'll tell you what, I just dropped it in my pocket. There. And so last week we looked at the timing of Christmas, that it was the fullness of time, and we asked the question, why? What was it about the time Jesus was born that made it the fullness of time? The answer, we don't know. God just said it was the right time. And so a lot of times, you know, if you look at the times, what was going on? Rome was in charge. It's when Augustus Caesar was emperor, which was really a high point for Rome as far as power, peace, and so forth. Did that have anything to do with it? I don't know. All I know is God said, it's time. And you know, the wonderful thing about how God works and moves is he usually does it at a time you least expect it. And that would have been a time most people would have least expected God to do something. Because remember, they were waiting for the Messiah to come. The Jews were waiting for the Messiah to come, but they had the wrong Messiah motif in mind. And when Jesus came, they had a difficult time working around that because in the Old Testament, there's two descriptions of the Messiah. One is he would come as the victorious ruler. The second is he would come as a suffering servant. Well, they had no interest in that one. They wanted the victorious ruler because they had been told, given a nationalistic gospel in a sense, a nationalistic message that when the Messiah comes, he's going to kick the Romans out, who happened to be their enemy at the time, and would restore Israel to its greatness. Plus, he would usher in a new spiritual awakening that would cause all men to be drawn to Jerusalem to worship God. So they had all this worked out in their mind of what they were expecting. Jesus comes, and people keep saying he's the Messiah, but then other people were looking at him and say, but he's not doing any of that. You know, even John the Baptist, who was the one of the most vocal advocates for Jesus being the Messiah at the end of his life, is doubting it. Because Jesus is not acting like he thought he ought to act. Anybody here ever have that problem? You were told or just thought, well, Jesus is supposed to do this, and he hasn't done this. And so what happens? Like John, we get offended. And so John is sitting in prison. He's offended that Jesus hasn't done something to vindicate him, to get him out of prison. And he sends his disciples to see Jesus and say, hey, are you really the one we're looking for, or should we be looking for someone else? And Jesus tells the disciples, you go back and tell John all the stuff that you're seeing and give him this message. Blessed is he who is not offended by me. Now that word offended means to cause to stumble. And so there's many people in Jesus' day, in our day, because God has not done what they think he ought to do, or usually it's because what they feel like they deserve. Because they certainly have earned at least a few brownie points with God. I mean, you know, they go to church on Easter whether they want to or not. They go to on Christmas whether they want to or not. That ought to be worth something. And then they find themselves in a crunch. And God doesn't do whatever it is they think he ought to do, and they get offended. And I can give you the names of some famous people that happened to. I'll give you the name of one right now that might surprise you. Charles Darwin, who was studying to be a minister. and his daughter became ill. He prayed God would heal her. He didn't. The daughter died, and that was his way of giving God the finger, was becoming an atheist and doing all he could do to create a narrative to supplant the biblical narrative of creation. So there's others, if you look throughout history, even in modern history, who grew up maybe believing God and praying, going to church and so forth, only to have something happen in their life, something came up, and God didn't do what they thought he ought to do, and they got offended and said, forget it. So the timing of his birth, that's what we looked at last week. We're not going to rehash all that today. Today we're going to look at the insignificance of the place of his birth. So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, which is actually Matthew bringing in Old Testament prophecy from the book of Micah, I believe. And it says, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah." In other words, among the cities, you may think you're the least, and the reason they thought they were the least, because in terms of size, they were. Bethlehem only had a couple hundred people living there. It was a rundown community, no real industry. It's just a few miles from Jerusalem. Their primary industry was shepherding. And what they were shepherding were the lambs used at the temple. So they were a special group of shepherds. They were hired by the temple. They were trained by the temple. They were the ones who, when lambs were born, would sort them out and identify those that they believed would qualify for sacrificial lambs, meaning they had to be perfect, versus those that could just be gotten rid of or raised for general purposes. And so that was the shepherds that come to the stable, was these guys who were employees of the temple, trained by the temple, but other than that, they were just shepherds like many other people. There was nothing that important about them. They didn't have their own Facebook page. We raise temple sheep. Yeah, we're better than everybody over here. No, they didn't. They just average people. They were insignificant people. But that's the city of Bethlehem. He said, because you think you're the least, but you're not. Because for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. And so today we're going to look at this theme of insignificance. Because as Christmas comes upon us, you hear all kinds of stories of what Christmas is all about. Now, you'll hear some talk about the baby Jesus, and that's great. It's great until they want to keep Jesus a baby in the manger. Because he didn't stay there. He grew up. Like that movie I told you about that time where the guy said, "I love the 6-pound, 4-ounce baby Jesus. That's the one I pray to. I don't pray to the adult Jesus. I don't like him. I like the baby Jesus." Well, Jesus grew up. He did not spend his entire life here as a baby in a manger. That's the beginning. In fact, we could say the birth of Christ was not the high point of history. It started things towards the high point of history. The high point of history happens 33 years later on a hill called Golgotha. But for now, he says, out of you will come a shepherd for my people. So let's look at this theme of insignificance today. Number one, Jesus made himself insignificant. Don't believe it? Philippians 2, verse 6. Who, being in the nature, by very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. And the word there, some translations use it, is he emptied himself. So in other words, every advantage Jesus had, as far as divinity goes, he laid it down to come to live as a man. Now, why is that important? That's important because he had to fully live as a man to be the sacrifice for man. If he came and he just kind of lived like an apparition among people, but he still had all this divine stuff going on around him, then he's not living as a man. So, and the reason is sin requires a price. And I mention this because we're in a day where not much is said about sin anymore. Sin requires a price. For Jesus to pay the price, first of all, he had to be born human, which he was. He had to live a perfect life, which he did. And then he had to die for our sins on the cross, which he did, because it's the shedding of blood that provides remission from sin. And so that's why Christmas is so important and the virgin birth so important. I shared with Wednesday night with a group that a popular preacher said recently and told his people recently, and I don't know if anybody called him out on it or not, but he said there's only 2 miracles you need to believe in to be a Christian. Okay? What's the 2 miracles? Creation and the resurrection. Well, no, because the virgin birth's got to be in there too. If there is no virgin birth, there is no remission from sin. Jesus could not die for anyone but himself if there's no virgin birth. So, it says he emptied himself by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So Jesus set the example here by making himself insignificant. Number 2, his birth took place in an insignificant place. And I gave you a minute ago a rundown on what Bethlehem was all about. It was a small, rundown community that most people overlooked, didn't pay much attention to, because it was just a sheep herder town for the most part. And but it was also a place where a faction of David's family went to settle hundreds of years earlier. So in terms of their modern day culture, Bethlehem was insignificant. He was born in an insignificant location, a stable. Now, when we think of stables, we may think of something like this. That's not what it was. Okay? That's not what a stable was. A stable was a cave. And what they would do is they would herd their sheep or whatever animals were into this cave. Somebody would stand guard at the entrance so they couldn't get in or out. And sometimes, as was the case here, if people were traveling and could not find a place to lodge, they would just move in there and sleep with the sheep or whatever happened to be in that cave. So you can imagine this cave Jesus was born in, they weren't there by themselves. There was probably other travelers in there with them. How'd you like that, ladies? I mean, you're ready to give birth, and then there's a bunch of folks you don't know standing around eating beef jerky or something watching. Wow. Whoa. Boy. Not exactly something you would enjoy, I don't think. But that's the stable. That's where they were. It was not a wood structure. The artists came up with that. And so they were in this cave. They lay him in the manger. All a manger was a hollowed out rock. And they would hollow out a rock or a side of the cave, and they would pour feed in it. And the livestock would eat out of that manger. And so they used the manger in that cave they were in to put Jesus in as his cradle. Now, you say, well, I like this better. Why can't it be that? Well, I'll tell you why. There's a church there today. And 200 years after the fact, early Christians were still visiting there, and all the original stuff was there. And so if it were wood, there would be nothing there. It was a cave. But it was an insignificant place. Jesus wasn't born at Johns Hopkins. He wasn't born at the nicest place in town. His mother didn't have that plush private room that all mothers get now at the hospital. And I guess it gets better and better. I haven't had to do that in a while. When we first did it with Heather, it was a little more primitive than that. And I was there coaching Danita through it. I put on the Three Stooges. I said, you'll feel better if you laugh.